What if I told you there is a plant that can produce 800 pounds of food per year with zero water? A plant that thrives in the harshest deserts, that has been a sacred food for thousands of years, and that holds the key to sustainable farming in a world that is running out of water. And what if I told you that this same plant was once considered an enemy, a biological weapon that conquered a continent, and that the very same creature that was used to destroy it is now threatening its existence in its native homeland? This is the incredible, contradictory story of the prickly pear cactus, or nopal, the plant of life that was turned into a weapon of war. My name is Marcus, and as a botanist, I have always been fascinated by the resilience of life in extreme environments. But there is no plant that embodies that resilience more than the prickly pear. This is a plant that can survive for 3 years without a single drop of rain. It uses a special type of photosynthesis called crassulation acid metabolism, or CAM, which allows it to open its pores at night to take in carbon dioxide, and then close them during the day to prevent water loss. While most plants lose massive amounts of water through their leaves during the heat of the day, the prickly pear keeps its stomata tightly shut, storing the carbon dioxide it collected during the cool night hours. It is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, a plant that has perfected the art of survival in a world of scarcity. Studies have shown that the prickly pear uses only about 20% of the water that traditional crops require. That means it can produce food with 80% less water than corn, wheat, or soybeans. And it is a plant that can produce an astonishing amount of food with virtually no resources. Let me give you some numbers that will put this in perspective. A dense stand of prickly pear can produce up to 400 tons of biomass per hectare per year under ideal conditions. Some reports from Mexico suggest that it can reach up to 800 or even 1,000 tons in particularly fertile areas. To put that in context, sugarcane, which is considered one of the most productive crops on the planet, produces about 100 tons per hectare. The prickly pear can produce 4 times as much. And in dry areas, without any irrigation or fertilizers, prickly pear can yield 5 times more dry feed than natural grassland. A single backyard patch, properly managed, can produce hundreds of pounds of edible pads and fruit every year. It is a level of productivity that is almost unimaginable for a plant that requires no irrigation. And it is a level of productivity that could change the way we think about agriculture in a world that is facing a global water crisis. For thousands of years, the prickly pear has been a cornerstone of life in the Americas. In Mexico, where it is known as nopal, it is more than just a food. It is a symbol of national identity, woven into the very fabric of the nation's history and mythology. According to Aztec legend, the god of sun and war, Huitzilopochtli, instructed his people to leave their homeland of Aztlan and wander until they found a sign: an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. They wandered for generations, and finally, on a small island in Lake Texcoco, they saw the sign. There, on a prickly pear cactus growing from a rock, sat an eagle with a snake in its talons. On that spot, they built the great city of Tenochtitlan, which would later become modern Mexico City. The image of the eagle on the cactus is still featured on the Mexican flag today, a testament to the enduring power of this plant in the cultural imagination. The Aztecs called it Nochtli, and they considered it sacred. La planta de vida, the plant of life. They used its juice to treat burns and wounds. They ate its pads and its fruit. They fed it to their livestock, and they even used it to create a brilliant red dye that would become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, they were amazed by the vibrant red textiles worn by the Aztec nobility. The color was deeper and more brilliant than any red they had seen in Europe. The source of this dye was a tiny insect, the cochineal, which lives on the pads of the prickly pear cactus. When crushed, The female cochineal insects produce a vivid crimson pigment called carminic acid. The Spanish quickly realized the value of this dye, and it became Mexico's second most valuable export after silver. For centuries, Spain held a jealous monopoly on the cochineal trade, and the color red became a symbol of power and authority in Europe. Kings wore red robes, cardinals wore red vestments, and the soldiers of the British Army wore their famous red coats. The British desperately wanted to break the Spanish monopoly, and it was this desire that led to the prickly pear's fateful journey across the ocean. In 1788, the British First Fleet, on its way to establish a penal colony in Australia, stopped in Brazil to collect prickly pear plants infested with cochineal insects. The plan was to establish a cochineal dye industry in the new colony of New South Wales. It was a bold idea, an attempt to create a new source of wealth in a distant land. But the plan failed. The cochineal insects soon died off in the unfamiliar Australian climate. But the cactus survived, and it thrived. In the arid interior of Australia, the prickly pear found a new home, a home with no natural enemies to keep it in check. There were no insects to eat it, no diseases to weaken it, no animals that had evolved to graze on its spiny pads. It spread like a wildfire, a slow-motion green invasion that consumed everything in its path. By the early 1900s, the prickly pear was advancing at a rate of more than 1,000 hectares a day. By the 1920s, 60 million acres of land in Queensland and New South Wales were infested with a dense, impenetrable wall of cactus, in some places up to 20 feet high. The plant was so thick that you could not walk through it, you could not ride a horse through it, and you certainly could not farm on it. Ranchers watched helplessly as their pastures were swallowed by the green tide. Land was being abandoned, and entire communities were being displaced. The Australian government was desperate for a solution. They tried everything, burning the plants, digging them up, crushing them with giant horse-drawn rollers, poisoning them with arsenic. In 1926, the Queensland Prickly Pear Land Commission reported that over 31,000 tins of arsenic pentoxide and nearly 28,000 tins of a mixture of sulfuric acid and arsenic had been sold to farmers trying to fight the invasion. But nothing worked. The prickly pear was unstoppable. For every plant they destroyed, 10 more seemed to spring up in its place. And so, in an act of desperation, the Australian government turned to biological warfare. In 1913, the Queensland government had sent a team of biologists to North and South America, where prickly pear was native, to find its natural enemies. They discovered that in its homeland, the cactus was kept in check by a variety of insects and diseases. The First World War interrupted their plans, but in 1920, the Commonwealth, Queensland, and New South Wales governments established the Commonwealth Prickly Pear Board. They sent a group of entomologists to Argentina under the leadership of a scientist named Alan Dodd to collect the biological agents they had identified. And in a small region of Argentina, they found what they were looking for: a small, unassuming gray moth called Cactoblastis cactorum. The Cactoblastis moth is not much to look at. It is a plain, brownish-gray insect, about an inch long, but it is a cactus killing machine. The female moth lays her eggs in a distinctive chain, called an egg stick, on the surface of the cactus pads. When the larvae hatch, they work as a team, eating their way through the tough outer skin of the pad to get at the soft, juicy interior. There, they feast on the plant's flesh, hollowing it out from the inside. In a matter of weeks, a colony of Cactoblastis larvae can reduce a healthy cactus pad to a rotting, collapsing shell, and when they have finished with one plant, they move on to the next. The first 2 attempts to breed the moths in Australia failed, so 3,000 eggs were imported directly from Argentina. From those eggs, 527 female moths hatched, and from those moths, over 100,000 eggs were produced. the second generation yielded over 2.5 million eggs. The moth was spectacularly productive. In 1926, the first Cactoblastis moths were released into the Australian bush. The results were beyond anything the scientists had hoped for. The moths multiplied at a phenomenal rate, spreading across the infested areas like a wave of destruction. At the height of the operation, the breeding station at Chinchilla was sending out as many as 14 million Cactoblastis eggs a day across Queensland and New South Wales. By 1933, just 7 years after the first release, 80% of the infested land in Queensland had been cleared. In New South Wales, the figure was 50 to 60%. It is still regarded as one of the most spectacular and successful examples of biological weed control in history. The plant that had conquered a continent was itself conquered by a tiny moth. The people of Queensland were so grateful that they built a memorial hall in the town of Boonarga, dedicated to the Cactoblastis moth. It is the only monument in the world dedicated to an insect. But the story does not end there. In a tragic twist of irony, the same moth that was used to save Australia is now threatening the very existence of the prickly pear in its native homeland. In 1957, the Cactoblastis moth was introduced to the Caribbean island of Nevis to control prickly pear populations there. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But the Caribbean is not Australia. The Caribbean is close to Mexico, close to the prickly pear's native range, close to the place where this plant is not a weed, but a sacred food. The moths spread from island to island, and eventually they reached the Florida Keys. From there, they began their slow march westward, toward Texas, toward Mexico. They are now attacking the native Opuntia species that are a vital part of the ecosystem and the culture. The weapon that was used to destroy the prickly pear in one part of the world is now destroying it in the place where it is most cherished. It is a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of our attempts to control nature, a cautionary tale about the dangers of playing God. And what a tragedy it would be to lose this incredible plant. The prickly pear is not just a survivor, it is a giver. The entire plant is edible, from the flat, paddle-shaped pads called nopals or cladodes, to the sweet, juicy fruit called tunas. The pads are a staple of Mexican cuisine, eaten by millions of people every day. They can be grilled, boiled, sautéed, or added to salads, stews, and scrambled eggs. They have a flavor that is often compared to green beans or asparagus, with a slightly mucilaginous texture that some people love and others need time to get used to. But beyond their taste, they are incredibly nutritious. They are high in fiber, which helps with digestion and makes you feel full. They are rich in vitamins A and C, and they contain significant amounts of calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And perhaps most importantly, they have been shown in multiple scientific studies to help regulate blood sugar levels, making them a valuable food for people with type 2 diabetes. The fruit is equally impressive, a delicious and refreshing treat that is packed with antioxidants, including betalains, the same compounds that give beets their deep red color. Scientists in Mexico have also discovered that the prickly pear can be used to produce biofuel. The pads are chopped up, mixed with manure, and fermented to produce methane. The local government of Zitácuaro in the state of Michoacán has already signed agreements to use this nopal-based biofuel for its municipal vehicles. This is significant because 97% of the world's biofuels are made from monoculture crops like corn, soy, and oil palm, which destroy native ecosystems and require massive amounts of water and fertilizer. The prickly pear offers a sustainable alternative, a biofuel that can be produced in the desert, on land that is unsuitable for other crops, with virtually no water. If you want to grow prickly pear yourself, it is remarkably easy. The plant is hardy in zones 4 through 9, which covers most of the continental United States. It needs well-draining soil and a sunny spot, but beyond that, it requires almost no care. You can start a new plant simply by cutting off a pad, letting it dry for a few days to form a callus, and then planting it in the ground. It will root and begin to grow, and within a few years, you will have a productive plant that will provide you with food for decades. I have a few prickly pear cacti in my garden, and I am always amazed by their stoic beauty. They are a living sculpture, a testament to the power of life to adapt and to thrive in the most challenging of conditions. And every summer, when they produce their beautiful yellow flowers and their sweet, jewel-like fruit, I am reminded of the incredible gift that this plant is. Have you ever eaten prickly pear? Have you ever experienced the unique flavor and texture of this desert survivor? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. The story of the prickly pear is a story of our own complicated relationship with the natural world. It is a story of how we can turn a gift into a weapon, a source of life into a source of destruction. It is a story of how a plant that was sacred to one culture became a plague to another, and how the solution to that plague became a new threat to the original culture. But it is also a story of hope. It is a story of how we can learn from our mistakes, of how we can find new ways to work with nature, rather than against it. The prickly pear is still here, still offering its gifts, still waiting for us to recognize its true value. It is a plant that can feed us, heal us, and inspire us. It is a plant that can teach us how to live in a world of limits, how to find abundance in scarcity, how to thrive in the face of adversity. It is the plant of life, and it is a plant that we need now more than ever. I think about the farmers in Australia who watched their land being swallowed by this plant, who saw their livelihoods destroyed by a green tide that seemed unstoppable. And I think about the farmers in Mexico who have grown this same plant for generations, who depend on it for food and income, who are now watching it being destroyed by the very moth that saved Australia. The same plant, the same story, but with the roles reversed. It is a powerful reminder that there is no such thing as a weed, only a plant in the wrong place. What is a curse in one context can be a blessing in another. What is a problem in one ecosystem can be a solution in another. The prickly pear is neither good nor evil. It is simply a plant, doing what plants do, trying to survive and reproduce. It is we who have created the problems, by moving plants and insects around the world without understanding the consequences, by trying to impose our will on nature without respecting its complexity. But there is another lesson in this story, a more hopeful one. The prickly pear reminds us that nature is full of solutions, if only we have the wisdom to see them. In a world that is getting hotter and drier, in a world where water is becoming increasingly scarce, in a world where we need to find new ways to feed a growing population without destroying the planet, the prickly pear offers a path forward. It is a plant that can grow where nothing else will grow. It is a plant that can produce food without irrigation. It is a plant that can help us adapt to a changing climate. And it is a plant that has been doing all of this for thousands of years, long before we arrived on the scene. The indigenous peoples of the Americas understood this. They did not see the prickly pear as a weed to be eradicated. They saw it as a gift to be cherished. They cultivated it. They harvested it. They integrated it into their diets and their cultures. They understood that this spiny, strange-looking plant was a source of life in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. And they passed that knowledge down through the generations, a living tradition that continues to this day. When you eat nopals in a Mexican restaurant, when you drink a prickly pear margarita, when you spread prickly pear jelly on your toast, you are participating in a tradition that is thousands of years old. You are connecting with a plant that has sustained human life for millennia. And perhaps that is the most important thing we can learn from the prickly pear. In our modern world, we have become disconnected from the plants that sustain us. We buy our food in plastic packages at the supermarket, and we have no idea where it comes from or how it was grown. We have forgotten that every meal we eat is a gift from the earth, a product of sunlight and water and soil and the incredible ingenuity of plants. The prickly pear can help us remember. It can help us reconnect with the natural world, with the cycles of growth and harvest, with the simple miracle of a plant that can turn sunlight into food. It can help us see that we are not separate from nature, but part of it, dependent on it, connected to it in ways that we are only beginning to understand. So the next time you see a prickly pear cactus, whether it is growing wild in the desert or cultivated in a garden, take a moment to appreciate it. Think about its incredible journey from the highlands of Mexico to the shores of Australia and back again. Think about the people who have depended on it for food and medicine and dye. Think about the moth that destroyed it and the moth that now threatens it. And think about what this plant can teach us about resilience, about adaptation, about finding abundance in the most unlikely places. The prickly pear is more than just a plant. It is a story, a symbol, a lesson. It is a reminder that the natural world is full of wonders, if only we have the eyes to see them.